Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, or whatever it may be by the time you get this. I am coming to you again today from home. For those of you actually watching the video, you may see that I am presentably attired. I have got my best Pluralsight shirt on at the moment because as soon as I finish this video, I'm going to do my next video in the quarterly series we're doing on creating security-centric culture. I won't tell you what we're actually going to do it on just yet. I might sort of, like lead that out a little bit. But I think this is a really, really interesting quarterly topic. Now, remember also, these are the videos which we're putting out for free in front of the paywall so everyone gets access to it, which makes me enormously happy because there's more people that can come and have a listen to some of the things I've got to say, which hopefully are of interest. If you're watching this, then you're probably interested in some of these things. It'll be a bunch of stuff that you've probably heard before and a whole bunch of other stuff which hopefully you haven't, or maybe just some different perspectives on it. Now, speaking of different perspectives, this is a good lead-in into the HTTPS thing. We seem to keep doing HTTPS a lot lately. HTTPS, though, is especially topical at the moment, and it will be for the next week due to the impending release of Chrome 68. Now, Chrome 68 will hit on Tuesday 24. And the reason why this is a really significant release is because that's when every non-secure site, transport layer non-secure, is going to be flagged as, you guessed it, non-secure. So it'll be like, in fact, it'll be exactly like what it is at the moment if you go to anywhere in Chrome that has a login field or credit card details, if you go to anywhere in Chrome that has an input box and you type something in it, if you go to anywhere in Chrome in incognito mode, every one of those conditions already says not secure if it is a non-secure origin. Now it's going to do the same thing, or non-secure connection rather. It's going to do exactly the same thing on every Chrome browser as we roll over into Tuesday next week, which probably means Wednesday for me because we are in the future here in Australia. And that is a major thing. Now, because of that, there's been a lot of activity in the lead up to this, everything from press. I had more than an hour interview with the media outlet yesterday talking about this, through to obviously certificate authorities are seeing this as a great opportunity to plug what it is that they do, which is understandable. This is leading everyone to get more certificates. And of course, I've been writing stuff. I've been doing the HTTPS's Easy series, 17 languages now. It's in Persian as well since last week when I had 16. I did the Why Your Static Site Needs HTTPS thing, and I've got a couple of other things in the works. In fact, just last night I had, I don't know why I do this, but I get ideas about things I want to do, and I have absolutely no time to do them, but I'm going to do it anyway because I've been wasting like a third of my day sleeping is one of the things I've worked out lately. Coffee machine's back too, so it's fixed the sleeping problem. So anyway, I had this idea. I'm going to tell you the domain name. I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to do with it yet, but I should be able to talk about that next week. The domain name is whynohttps.com. So whynohttps.com. So I have an idea on that, which is actually still formulating. I've got the sort of heart of it. I think it's going to be interesting. I'm going to plan to get that out for the Tuesday event, or the Wednesday event as it may be with Chrome. Now, I am just conscious that when we sort of approach an event like this, or anything else, I guess, significant in the industry, where we're working towards a date where something happens or changes, you end up with a huge amount of material. And in fact, I'm going to write something for Cloudflare as well. And I was speaking to them this morning. I was saying, look, let's write something, but not just do the same old benign, boring crap that you're going to read everywhere else. Like, let's do something different with a different angle on it. And this thing I've got in store for that domain name, I think is going to be quite different. I haven't seen this anywhere before, but I think it's going to be quite interesting. So that's on my list. Now, I talked about, how do we get here? Like different views or different impressions or interpretations or something. There are those who walk amongst us who are not so keen on the whole HTTPS thing. And there are a few interesting things that sort of happened during this week along those lines. And this is almost like the meta discussion about HTTPS. It's like the HTTPS stuff is happening anyway. Like Chrome's doing what they're doing. Other browsers will increasingly flag insecure connections as dangerous, all this sort of stuff. You've got no control over that. Like we are all on this journey. But there are still these discussions happening around it about how wrong it is or bad it is or whatever else. They're quite interesting in some ways. Now, I I saw something really interesting. I'm just going to actually get the tweet up here. One of the curious things, and you're going to see a theme here, is that those who are very much against HTTPS being driven as it is at the moment is that they're not real keen on other people's views. Now, you may be hearing this and go, yes, but aren't I critical about their views? Well, yes, I am, but I'm never going to silence them. I'm never going to stop them from commenting. We will talk about an exception on that in a moment. I certainly don't want to block them or mute them or things like that, so long as they're not being total dicks about it. But it doesn't seem to work the other way. And what I'm seeing is a number of discussions from people that are really negative against the HTTPS thing that get very derogatory, aggressive. I'm going to give you some examples of this in a moment. That get really quite nasty. And I'm also seeing a lot of basically sticking the fingers in the ears and singing, like trying to mute out everything around them. I tweeted, when was this? The 14th. This was 6 days ago on the weekend. I said one of the really odd things both Scott Helm and I have noticed is the prevalence with which those rejecting the industry-wide push for HTTPS have blocked both of us. Why is that? Is it an insecurity thing? Wasn't meant to be a pun. Many people pointed out it is kind of a pun. Something else, it's very strange. And in fact, I had a screen cap here of Dave Weiner. Some of you may remember Dave from such blog posts as Scott's one about anti-vaxxers. Come back to anti-vaxxers in a moment. And apparently I got blocked by Dave. Now, I'm not really quite sure because I actually made quite a point of not engaging with Dave because, obviously he let's say he has very strongly held views. So I'm not sure why that happened, but there seems to be sort of this constant attempt to mute anyone with a different viewpoint. And not just, like, muting is one thing. I certainly mute people. It's just like, look, I don't need this in my timeline. But blocking altogether is I find it a much more aggressive action. I'm not sure why that is. Obviously he's not real happy with the reality of how things are panning out at the moment, but that is an odd trend. Now, as part of this trend of people who are not real keen on the HTTPS things, Scott recently wrote about, I'm going to get you the right title of this, and I probably should link this in. I'm sure I've spoken about it before. What is Scott Helm anti-vaxxers? So Scott wrote about HTTPS anti-vaxxers, dispelling the common arguments against securing the web. And what he actually did is he talked about 4 different people who have quite a large degree of influence on the internet. Dave was one of them. And he sort of took the arguments that I'm making against HTTPS and very systematically broke them apart and explained why they were wrong. Now, this is the sort of discussion we want to be having. We want to be having the discussion where we can respectfully say, look, these are your views, this is why they don't sort of stack up or why the science doesn't support it or whatever it may be. Now, he used the term anti-vaxxers, which upset some people. Now, curiously, it didn't so much upset anti-vaxxers themselves. I mean, this is people who are sort of against vaccination. Now, depending on where you are in the world, you may have different tolerances to that. In Australia, they will financially penalise you if you don't vaccinate your children. There's lots of penalties and things. Frankly, I think that's rightfully so. Let's not get into that whole debate, though. Regardless, it upset some people. The people it seemed to actually upset is people who were being offended on behalf of other people that Scott was labelling as anti-vaxxers. Seems to be a lot of this these days. People love to get offended on behalf of other people. Interesting social observation. Now, I think they felt that it was a bit of a derogatory term. And of course, what the term is really referring to is the rejecting of the science. So there is a very big scientific body of evidence which suggests that you should vaccinate your children, that you should use HTTPS, that the Earth is round and not flat. This brings us to one of the problems we had this week, because one of the sort of constant comparisons of HTTPS naysayers and anti-vaxxers is flat earthers. Now, again, this is like rejecting the science. There are those who walk amongst us who believe the Earth is flat. Believe it or not, somehow the discussion about HTTPS descended into a flat earther, like literally someone who believes the Earth is flat, arguing with people about the Earth being flat. Now, the way this panned out, I'm going to link to this because I was just reading this going like, holy shit, this just cannot get any weirder right now. Someone here says, I'm finding this is on the Twitters, I'm finding this whole HTTPS intensely frustrating And I'm now limiting myself to how much effort I put in to compete in the noise. Fair point. You have the stupid peeps, obviously, but you also have the educated saying really dumb stuff. I wonder who he could be referring to. Like some internet flat earth nonsense. Now, here's where it all went wrong. When this guy put flat earth, he hashtagged it, flat earth. And moments later, we have a Twitter account called Flat Earth City chiming in. And Flat Earth City is a flat earther. Like literally, they just think the earth is flat. And this person chimes in with a video called Flat Earth Best of the Best Hardcore Evidence, which is all of this quote unquote evidence. For people on the podcast, I'm air quoting. Evidence of the earth being flat. Now, here's where the funny analogies sort of continue. Funny, insightful, interesting, I don't know. Analogies continue. All the YouTube videos this account posts have comments turned off. They don't want to allow comments. Dave Weiner had actually gone through and deleted comments that disagreed with him earlier on, obviously doing the blocking thing as well. And it's just getting really weird, like how much actual flat earthers have in common with people who don't believe in HTTPS. So anyway, this flat earther account then descends into these really, really weird things. And I'm now copied into this. And believe you me, I did not engage after the first few tweets because I was like, this is just too weird. This guy's like, all caps as well. Love all caps, these guys. So someone has actually posted a photo just here. Why am I in this? It's like a photo of the Great Barrier Reef in Queensland. So beautiful sort of crystal blue water, turquoise colours. Okay, I took one of the photos you posted earlier that you said proves the earth is flat. Guess what? There is a curve. Because what these flat earthers do, I've learned things this week. What the real flat earthers do is they take photos people have taken of the scenery and they put a ruler across the horizon and go, horizon's flat, therefore the earth is flat. And this flat earther account posted one of these and went, horizon flat, earth is flat. Someone else took this and went, actually, there's a little bit of a curve. And then Flat Earth City quote tweets this and says, it's ice, dude. You can watch it be flat. Any pond or lake you can find. So basically saying if you see ice on a pond or lake, you see it's flat. Therefore, it proves that the earth is round. It proves it's flat. Shit, I can't even get it right myself. And as I'm reading this, I'm thinking this is just like saying HTTPS is there because it's a book burning exercise from Google. Book burning exercise from Google. Ice on the lake is flat. All same sort of crazy category. And then this sort of, I'm going to link to the tweets. And if you just want to blow time looking at how crazy other people are to make you feel normal, this is an excellent resource for that. So go and have a look at it. Okay, as much as this is funny, I do on a more serious note find it curious to see just how consistent the flat earther was with the HTTPS naysayers. Now, along those lines as well, I did have to ban someone from commenting this week, which is a really, really unusual thing for me. I would say maybe 3 or 4 times a year, I would ban someone for commenting. That's not just like a bot or spamming or something like that, but someone who's actually engaging in conversation. And there's an account here. I'm actually going to read some of the comments. Or part of one comment. I got up, when was this? It must have been Tuesday morning. And I had 60 comments on my blog post about why your static site needs HTTPS. And I've looked at it and I'm seeing Scott Helm's name all the way down. And I've messaged him and I'm just going, what have you done? What hell have you unleashed whilst I've been asleep? Anyway, there's a guy who's left some comments. And I actually won't mention his name because he's subsequently gone through and deleted them all. Are you seeing a trend here? But this guy was so angry about the HTTPS things. And I'll just read you part of one of the comments here. He says, let me see what this is in response to first. So basically this guy started getting very upset about Cloudflare, said, look, as soon as you delegate your name servers to use Cloudflares, then you've got all sorts of issues. And Scott said, can you elaborate on how using Cloudflare name servers is a security risk? Is that an issue with them in particular, or is using their name servers and then it cuts off my email feed. I think he said a security risk. Now, Scott's comments here, and I would like to think my comments as well, are all very reasonable and factual. And, can you explain your thinking? So this guy says, seriously, I have listened to you speaking, and sadly enough, as an articulate Englishman, I can't really afford the time to define why pointing name servers to a third party is a security issue. Actually, let me just rephrase those last few words. is a security issues. The names, who runs their own name servers? Like if your threat is someone may do nasty things to name servers, well, you're always going to be using someone's name servers somewhere. And I think Scott's point here was, are you particularly worried about Cloudflare for some reason? Now, the guy had gone and watched some of Scott's talks. So he starts to delve into a critique, for want of a better term, of Scott's talks. He says, do you ever get heckled? Do you find your monotone northern dialect goes under the radar overseas? Now, to me, everyone is northern, right? Because I'm in Australia. But apparently, if you're in England, Scott has a northern dialect. I just think it all sounds like a weird accent to me, and I'll equally heckle everyone for that very purpose. But evidently, this guy was from somewhere further south in England, so I don't know, like a couple of k's further south. And Scott's accent he was not happy about. This is like the level these discussions descend into. I'm trying hard not to insult you. Not doing such a good job of it, by the way, mate. But as a member of the shallow end of the social spectrum, I find it hard to stomach the fact that I'm getting worked up now with you. Maybe if you read my white paper on, and then all caps, another theme with the flat earther. I just realised that. The internet has been murdered. You might see where I'm coming from. And it's... So this guy, like when I got up and I sort of saw, I had 60 comments and I messaged Scott, you know, what have you done sort of thing. He said, you know, you need to ban this guy. And I'm like, dude, like we've just been critical of people like Dave for banning people, deleting comments, trying to silence the internet. Like the last thing I want to do is then be hypocritical and go away and actually ban the person. And then I read the comments and they just were continuously derogatory about things like Scott's accent. Now, look, I'm happy to joke all day long about him having a funny accent. If you haven't seen the foot gun video, and I can't say what it actually sounds like, go and see the foot gun video. But, you know, there is a point where it becomes aggressive and derogatory and you deviate off what is a technical discussion, as much as I may not agree with many of the points, and you get to the point where it's just being nasty and it's not making it a fun place. And frankly, kudos to Scott for remaining cool. What I always find, and he and I had this discussion later on, is that the crazier someone is, the cooler you are. And when I say cool, it's just like be respectful, ask technical questions, you know, be, I guess, factual about the whole thing. It's almost like the bigger the gap is between your levels of professionalism and the crazier they look as a result. So, you know, he did the right thing there. So I ended up replying once and sort of addressing each one of the categories of issues the guy had over the many comments that he'd left, and then said, look, I'm going to ban you. Here's the reason I'm banning you. Here's the comments that are, or rather the page on commenting on my blog, which effectively says, be nice to other people, don't be derogatory, don't insult people. You know, none of the nasty stuff that all of us as reasonable people would say is just not cool in a place like a blog comments. So that, I know I just spent like a quarter of an hour talking about weird HTTPS stuff, but this is just such a strange theme. And, you know, I don't necessarily want to group everyone who's technically smart and has arguments that they feel are important into the same category as how nasty this person was. But this thread, everything from the silence the comments through to the all caps through to the, you know, block everyone we don't agree with, is just, I just find it remarkable. Anyway, moving on, let's talk about new stuff, blog stuff. So this week I wrote a couple of blog posts, and one of them was about a GDPR course on Pluralsight. Now, I'm just opening up this blog here. So that there's sort of a couple of interesting aspects to me doing a GDPR course. And one of them is I'm Australian. Evidently, I'm on the other side of the world to where these regulations have been born. GDPR does impact all of us in one way or another because of the influence it has on many of the services we use, both those in the EU and outside the EU. So I, like many other people, got bombarded with many emails as we approached the end of May. So certainly I couldn't escape it in that way. And of course, we consequently see GDPR being mentioned many times since, particularly as it relates to violations of privacy. So I'm very interested in it from that perspective. Now, Pluralsight wanted to do a course on GDPR. There is one in the library already, built by a guy called John Elliott. And John Elliott is the guy who I've subsequently done this play-by-play course with. So this is the one where the two of us are there on camera talking to each other. And John is a data protection officer for a very large European brand that you all know, but he doesn't tend to sort of publicly state, so he keeps himself associated, or disassociated. I'm sure you can figure it out if you want to. He has a privacy degree and an information security background. So he's a super, super well-qualified guy to be able to talk about GDPR. And being a plural site author, he's used to sort of talking to the camera and articulating things. So we did this GDPR course whilst I was away in London. This was last month. I did mention it in one of my weekly updates. I think when I was with Scott in Oslo, I spoke about it in an update. And yeah, we recorded this course. We got it out pretty quickly. Normally play-by-plays take 6-8 weeks plus. But this one is relevant because what we really wanted to talk about, this was only 13 days after GDPR had hit. We really wanted to talk about what are we learning now that it is here. Now, it's a little bit like the HTTPS thing I mentioned before, where there's a million pieces written about GDPR, and we didn't want it to be that. We wanted it to be something that had a different perspective. So what I really wanted to do is, what are we learning as the regs have now hit? So, what are we seeing as a result? So, for example, we looked at things like, you probably have seen, particularly if you're in Europe, that if you were visiting some US news sites, either it would be unavailable altogether, or you would get a different experience from Europe as opposed to if you went to the same site from the US. Now, for many of us, when we're sort of technical people and we understand not only the concept of traveling around the world, and incidentally, you do go around the world when you're traveling, just want to put that in there, and you can still be a European and go to somewhere else and then get a totally different experience to if you're in Europe. We also understand things like VPNs and the fact that you can get yourself a very different experience depending on where your outbound connection is perceived to be from. So I found it very interesting to sort of see the way news sites were tailoring things. So that's one of the things we spoke about, like, why are services doing this? Does this satisfy GDPR? Will this change? In fact, we have a look at some of the services. Like John spins up one of the news sites on his machine with a UK outbound IP address. I VPN to somewhere in the US, I think, and then it's like, wow, it's totally different. Incidentally, the US experience is kind of crap because it's full of ads, and then the ads are gone from the European experience. So that was interesting. We had a look at a number of different industry incidents which have caused some debate around GDPR. So a good example, and I mentioned this in the launch blog post as well, there was a data breach of a South African company called ViewFinds. Now, this is a data breach that went into Have I Been Pwned. It was disclosed to me, worked with media, etc., all communicated to the company. And I think there was nearly 1 million email addresses in there. And this was if you had been driving your car around South Africa and like a speed camera or something snapped you. You could then go to this site and view the fine. And after that breach happened, I saw multiple people saying, well, GDPR will fix this, or GDPR will at least compel ViewFinds to, say, report it to a local regulatory authority somewhere in the EU. And we're sort of saying, or rather the sentiment that people were expressing was that there would be additional rights granted to people from Europe as a result of GDPR in an incident like this. And I'm saying to John, like, okay, first of all, you've got to be in South Africa. This is not like, it wasn't I browsed to a website and then I got a speeding ticket. You got to be in the country. So, okay, you're still European, but you're in the country. Pretty much everyone in there, almost everyone in there, but let's say for argument's sake, 99% of people are going to be South African people because they're most of the people who are driving around on the roads. How is GDPR really going to influence what these guys are doing? And where this discussion goes, without sort of giving too much the story away, is it's very interesting to sort of look on the one hand of what the regulations say, and there's a lot of room for interpretation in lots of areas too. And then on the other hand, look at what is really going to be enforceable as well. And I forget exactly the way we led into it, but I sort of said to John, are we really going to see an EU regulator sort of extend their reach down to South Africa and try and penalise, let's say, ViewFinds because some of the data in there was from someone who visited South Africa on a holiday and then got a speeding ticket? And I think the way John put it was, he said, well, what does your gut say? And I was like, well, I just can't ever see that happening. And he's like, yeah, well, there you go. So what I really liked about John in doing these videos is that he has a way of explaining things that's just really easy to consume. And indeed, I think that is the skill for doing any sorts of teaching. But particularly for something like GDPR, where there has been a lot of confusion and there's been a lot of people with very strongly held beliefs about what it does or does not mean, that we really needed this. And his take was super, super refreshing. For example, I will see commentary on the internet around things like someone sent out a mass mail, they accidentally CC'd people instead of BCC people, you're going to get hit with €20 million fine or 4% of annual gross worldwide turnover, whichever is higher. And I'm going, well, but this is not what it's meant to be about. It's not meant to be about destroying a business because someone put some email addresses in the wrong field. This is not the way it's meant to work. And this is what a lot of the discussion is about, right? So what are we actually seeing in terms of, it's a little bit too early for penalties and things like that, but what are we seeing in terms of things like GDPR transgressions, and what are we likely to see as a result of that? Now, one other thing as well, and I mentioned this in the blog post, I subsequently, after doing this video, and this was something I was working towards anyway, but after doing it and seeing how well John dealt with the whole thing, I have engaged him formally to do the GDPR compliance stuff for Have I Been Pwned. Now, this, in some ways, is actually much simpler than what I expected. And to be honest, things that are much simpler are things like the legal basis for processing the data, which comes from the breaches. That there are multiple legal bases for processing someone's data. Not every single one of them involves consent. So that, that's one of the things that sort of came up very early. There are other parts of it which are also a little bit trickier too. So he is working on that. We don't have a precise timeline for when it's going to be done, but that is something that he's actively working on. This is something which, to be honest, is a big investment on my behalf as well to get this done properly by someone who's a leader in their field. So I think this is important. I think it's the right thing to do for Have I Been Pwned. I am, to be honest, I do want to get this out as soon as possible. I think as I get it out as well, I'll share a little bit more insight about some of the things that were tricky, and indeed some of the things are a bit easier as well. And hopefully that will help other people too. So that's on the radar. Now, that was GDPR. Moving on, Azure Functions and Cloudflare. Now this, if I'm honest, was kind of one of these things where it's like, this is fun. I'm going to enjoy writing this. And this is sort of the common theme in this piece of work was serverless. And serverless is the idea of running code on servers. so there are still servers, but running code on servers, and you pay for executions of code as opposed for paying for the logical box of infrastructure that sits under it. Great example. Have I Been Pwned runs on an Azure app service. It currently runs on an S3 Azure app service. I think the cost of that was 40 cents an hour. So I pay 40 cents an hour for all of these people to come to Have I Been Pwned, load the pages, hit the API, because the API still runs on there. Now this is the published API, or rather documented API. There's another API that I moved over, and this is partly what this blog post is about. Bottom line is, it's like this one logical box. It's got X number of CPUs, X number of RAM. It's bound to that. If people start using enough resources on that logical box that it exceeds a predefined threshold, I will get an additional logical box. And now I've got two logical boxes. And then the same again, if they start using more than a predefined threshold of those two boxes together, I'll get another box, all the way up to 10 boxes if I want them. And if I get 10 boxes, I'll pay $4 an hour instead of 40 cents an hour. Now, several years ago, this was awesome. It was like, wow, this is so advanced. It just scales up and it does everything I need to. And it was, and it still is awesome in many ways, but it's also problematic. And one of the ways in which it's problematic is that observing of infrastructure utilization before adding on new instances needs a 5-minute lead time. So Azure needs to see 5 minutes of sustained activity over, in my case, a CPU threshold that I set, before it gives you another one. A lot can happen in 5 minutes. And what I've seen in the past is particularly when I get press. So I've seen incidents where Have I Been Pwned has been on primetime UK TV. And it's like simultaneously tens or hundreds of thousands of British people pick up their phone and they enter haveibeenpwned.com. And it just massively just smashes it in one go. And 5 minutes is just way, way too long. If it was too short, you'd have this risk of yo-yoing as well. So it's a little bit problematic when you do still have logical bounds underneath or boundaries underneath before it starts expanding and adding scale. The beauty of serverless, particularly in this consumption model, where the consumption model is you just pay for what you use, beauty of serverless is that in theory, you can just keep stretching and stretching and stretching as far as you need to go. So if more traffic comes on, it just routes it to another instance that's sitting there warm and ready to go. And you shouldn't see these problems where it's like you get this sudden hit of traffic and you're overburdening the resources before you get new ones. So it's great for that. That's what I've been using on Pwn Passwords, which has just worked beautifully, beautifully well. I wanted to start moving things over. And what I wanted to do is move over a unified search endpoint. So I've got one endpoint that I use for people who come to the front page of the website. When you put in your email address and go search, it hits one API that goes and asynchronously does a search on breaches and on paste, returns the results. The published API it does not include that. So the documented API only includes searching for breaches or searching for paste because frankly, most of the time people just want the breaches. Keeps things a bit easier on my side. Now, what I want to do was take that and move it into a function, but I wanted to test it along the way. So I wanted to go, okay, well, why don't I try, say, 20% of my audience and just see how it works for them. So 20% of the requests that come in, I want to send to the new function, and the remaining 80% can go to the old one. So I use Cloudflare workers. Now, Cloudflare workers are also serverless in that they run on no logical boundaries. So it's basically just code. It's like I'm going to write code, I'm going to push it to Cloudflare. It goes out to their 151 edge nodes as of today, and it just executes. And it can execute when a request comes in, and it can do things to the request itself and to the response. So for example, I actually broke it down in phases. I said, what I'm going to do is I just want to test this myself first. So I'm going to write a Cloudflare worker that looks for the presence of a particular cookie. And if that cookie exists, when the request comes in for the old API endpoint, it's going to redirect it to the new API endpoint and then return the response. So what it means is I can manually set the cookie on my browser, use the site just like it's meant to be used, except I'm hitting a different endpoint. The URL looks the same, but when Cloudflare gets that request, it's routing it differently. So I did that, had to make some tweaks because I did break one or two things, and then went, all right, now let's give it to 20% of people. So I just put in a condition in there, just randomized a number, 20% of people that fell under the number, then went off over to a different location, and they started getting the new API. And I effectively had what was, I guess, a couple of dozen lines worth of script, which allowed me to control how much of the traffic was flowing each way, and it takes effect within seconds as well. So it was a really, really cool way of sending people to different places. Now, as part of this also, I wanted to make sure that my deployment process into this new API endpoint was smooth, and in this blog post, I write about how I'm deploying from GitHub because that's the easiest way to deploy into an Azure App Service. But if you deploy directly into a live site, you do lose traffic as it sort of unloads the old stuff and the new stuff comes in. And I show some fiddler traces where I start getting a bunch of timeouts just because, or actually I think I got 503s. Got a bunch of 503s just because the service wasn't available at that time. So I set up a deployment slot, which is the ability to say, look, let's have my primary site, and then I'll have a slot. And I'll set the slot to auto deploy from GitHub. So I check into GitHub, push up, goes into here, check into Git, push up to GitHub, goes into the deployment slot, builds it, compiles it there. There might be some outage on the deployment slot. Doesn't matter, not a production slot. When that's ready, I swap the slots. And swapping the slots just literally goes take traffic from here over to here, swap your config settings as well to make sure things like production, connection strings stay in production, and it's magic and there's no outage. And then I sort of did the same thing with Fiddler. I'm just hammering it. It's like, let's have a look at the requests and responses, see if you can spot where we roll over from one slot to another. You can spot it because I changed the response size just so you could see it, but no outage. So that was cool too. I put that in. And then I had to do some DNS rollover because I migrated from one service to another. And I won't go into the details here because it did start to do my head in a little bit, if I'm honest. But I ended up using Cloudflare workers to say, look, I'm going to get this to help me do DNS rollover so that every time requests come in for this one host name, I'm actually going to start sending them to this other host name, even though DNS may not have updated for that client. And then after DNS is fully updated, then I can get rid of that worker and then people would just be going to the new host name because CNAME records and things would have been correctly updated. And this was really cool because in both of those cases, those workers are not persistent. They're not running anymore. I don't need them anymore. But I managed to use them to help, firstly, the process of testing, and then secondly, the process of rolling over from one piece of infrastructure to another. And it should have been totally seamless. Like, I shouldn't have lost any request in this process, which I'm actually pretty stoked about. So the Cloudflare workers are super, super awesome. There's really amazing stuff you can do with them in terms of making decisions about where traffic goes, but also doing things like you can respond directly from the edge. So one of the workers that I did leave in place is I said, look, after I migrated everything to the new API service on Azure Functions and I updated the Have I Been Pwned app so that everyone would hit the new one, if anyone was hitting the old one, then they're in the wrong place. You know, it's like someone using an undocumented API. So I'll just return 404 directly from the Cloudflare edge. You don't even have to go to the server. We have been using Cloudflare workers a lot on Report URI to do things like pre-flight cause requests. So if someone makes an options request to check whether or not their client can make cross-origin requests over to this site, we don't have to reply from the site itself. It's a predictable response. We can reply directly from Cloudflare, get a super, super fast answer back to the client. So anyway, the workers are really, really cool. I love how fast and efficient they are. So I'm going to probably write a little bit more about that later on as well. I know Scott Helm has written a bunch about other things we're doing with Report URI with workers as well. So check out his bits too. Okay, so I think that is pretty much all for this week. Last bit is the blog sponsor this week is Matchlight by Terbium. So Terbium, again, is one of these sponsors that has been around for quite a while. So I really appreciate what those guys do and giving me the ongoing support. And incidentally, I was just thinking this morning, you know how I mentioned I had that idea, I want to do the why no HTTPS thing. Part of the reason why I have the luxury to go off on these sort of harebrained ideas is because of sponsors like Terbium that do actually pay to sort of, you know, keep the whole thing running, or rather, let me rephrase that because I don't really have to pay much to keep a blog running. It means that I have the luxury of saying I'm going to go off and do something which is just a personal thing, an itch I want to scratch. And look, I really hope that does contribute back to the usefulness of what everyone gets out of this service as well. But you know, again, sort of having sponsors and having sort of an independent assurance of someone paying the bills, it really, really helps. So next week will be Chrome 68 time. I will be coming to you from the New World Order of HTTPS by default, or you get a big warning on the world's most popular browser. And hopefully then I can share about why no HTTPS, share more about why no HTTPS. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll come to you from the new future of browsers next week.